was the kind of Tennessee night that made the air feel heavy, thick with humidity, still enough that you could hear the crickets half a mile away. In 1995, Maple Creek was the kind of town where everyone knew one another's dogs by name, where kids played barefoot in the yard until porch lights flickered on, and where parents didn't worry about locked doors. That sense of safety was something people in Maple Creek prided themselves on, until the night it disappeared along with 6-year-old Abigail Henson. Abby was the youngest of 2 children, a bright-eyed girl with a chipped front tooth and an endless collection of stuffed animals. Her parents, Linda and Paul Henson, lived in a modest white farmhouse on the edge of town. Paul worked at the sawmill, Linda stayed home with the kids, and their evenings were quiet routine in the best way. On that June night, dinner was grilled chicken, corn on the cob, and a scoop of ice cream before bed. Abby had fallen asleep clutching her favorite toy, a small gray rabbit she'd named Clover. Sometime between midnight and dawn, everything changed. When Linda woke just before 6, she noticed the hallway light was still on. The first thing she remembered later was the silence, the kind of silence that feels wrong. No birds, no sound of Abby's small feet patting down the hall like they usually did. She walked into her daughter's room and saw the blanket folded neatly near the pillow, but the bed was empty. The window was locked from the inside. The only sign of movement was Clover, Abby's stuffed rabbit, missing from its usual spot. Linda's first thought wasn't panic, it was confusion. She checked the bathroom, the laundry room, even the porch, thinking maybe Abby had woken early and gone to feed the cat. That's when she saw the front door. It was cracked open just an inch or two, and outside, lying near the threshold, was the stuffed rabbit. Its fur was damp from the morning dew, and there were small streaks of dirt on its ear. By the time Paul came stumbling out of the bedroom, still half asleep, Linda's voice had turned frantic. Within minutes, they were shouting Abby's name into the yard, then into the woods behind the house. Paul grabbed his truck keys and drove down the road, calling out her name through the open window. Linda stayed behind, dialing 911, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Within an hour, the Henson property was swarming with deputies from the county sheriff's office. They taped off the yard, brought in dogs, and began searching every inch of ground between the creek and the road. Neighbors gathered at the fence line, their faces pale. Maple Creek had never seen anything like it. Helicopters in the air, news vans parked along the shoulder, people whispering in disbelief. The search stretched through the day and deep into the night. Volunteers combed the fields shoulder to shoulder, some of them carrying lanterns, others calling at Abby's name until their voices cracked. Police drained the small pond near the barn, hoping for a clue, but it yielded nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not a single trace. It was as if Abby had stepped off the porch and vanished into thin air. Detectives from the State Bureau arrived the next morning. They interviewed the parents separately. Both said they'd gone to bed around 10. Paul claimed he locked the doors, as he always did. Linda said she checked on Abby around 11 and saw her sleeping soundly. There was no forced entry, no broken windows, no sign of a struggle. The locks were intact. Even the dog, a beagle named Scout, hadn't barked once. To investigators, that detail stood out. If someone had taken Abby, how had they entered so quietly? And why hadn't Scout made a sound? Rumors began spreading before the second night had even fallen. People talked in hushed tones at the diner and in the aisles of the grocery store. Maybe someone from out of town had been watching. Maybe it was a drifter, a trucker, a stranger passing through. But there were other whispers too, ones that didn't make it into the papers. Some said the police had been spending an awful lot of time inside the Henson house, asking the same questions over and over. By the third day, the case had drawn statewide attention. News anchors stood in front of the Henson property, describing the missing child with rehearsed solemnity. The photo they used showed Abby in a yellow sundress, smiling with a missing tooth and holding Clover by the ear. It became the image people couldn't shake, a symbol of innocence lost. The sheriff held daily press conferences. "We're treating this as an abduction," he said, his voice flat with exhaustion. But behind the scenes, investigators weren't sure. There were no tire tracks near the porch, no footprints, other than those of the family and searchers. And when they dusted the doorknob for prints, they found only the parents and Abby's. Neighbors were interviewed repeatedly. One woman down the road claimed she'd heard a car door slam around 2 a.m. Another insisted she'd seen a porch light flicker on and off. But nothing concrete came from it. The leads thinned out as quickly as they appeared. Meanwhile, Linda stopped sleeping. She sat in Abby's room night after night, staring at the empty bed, whispering prayers. Paul kept busy helping the search teams, driving miles of back roads, knocking on doors, leaving flyers at gas stations and churches. But every night he came home empty-handed, his face a little more hollow than before. The emotional fracture between them grew quietly. Linda blamed herself for not hearing something, for not locking the door again before bed. Paul blamed the world, the sheriff, anyone who asked too many questions. But when detectives noticed inconsistencies in their timelines, Paul claiming he checked the back door before bed while Linda said he hadn't, they began to look more closely at the people inside the house. On the fifth day, an investigator found something odd on the porch railing. A faint handprint, smudged but small, too small to be Paul's, too wide to be Abby's. They couldn't identify it. The press never learned about it, but inside the sheriff's office, it deepened the sense of unease. Someone had been there, someone who left no other trace. By the end of the week, Maple Creek began to change. Children were kept indoors. Porch lights stayed on through the night. The Henson house, once filled with laughter and Sunday dinners, turned into a monument of silence. As the search scaled back, the sheriff gathered his team one last time under the fading light of a Tennessee sunset. "We'll keep looking," he said, though no one truly believed it anymore. The woods had been combed, the fields cleared, the creeks dragged. There was nothing left to find. But even in the absence of evidence, something about the case refused to settle. It wasn't just the lack of answers, it was the sense that the truth was still inside that farmhouse, hidden behind someone's silence. Years later, those who were there that week would still remember the sound of that silence, the way it hung in the air after the searchers went home, after the reporters left, after the porch light burned out for good. They'd say it felt like the town itself had stopped breathing. And as the investigation grew cold, detectives began to ask themselves a question they couldn't shake. If no one broke in that night, then who opened the door? In the days that followed Abby Henson's disappearance, Maple Creek changed in ways no one could quite describe. The laughter that used to spill from porches was gone. The church bell still rang on Sundays, but people didn't linger afterward. Conversations lowered when the Hensons' name came up. Everyone wanted to believe it had been a stranger, that evil had come from outside. But deep down, many had begun to wonder if it had come from somewhere closer to home. Detectives from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation took over within 48 hours. They moved quickly, interviewing everyone in the Henson family, first separately, then together. Each story sounded rehearsed but not identical. Paul Henson said he'd gone out to his workshop that night after his wife and kids were asleep. He claimed he sometimes couldn't sleep, that he'd stayed up sanding a piece of furniture until nearly midnight before heading to bed. Linda, his wife, told investigators she heard him come back inside around 10. When they compared notes, that 2-hour gap became a small but significant crack in the family's version of events. Their teenage son, 17-year-old Caleb, barely spoke. He sat through the questioning with his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands trembling just enough for the lead detective to notice. When asked if he'd heard anything strange, that night Caleb just shook his head and muttered, "No." When pressed harder, his voice broke. "I don't remember." The detectives ran background checks, canvassed neighbors, and collected everything that might hold a clue. The workshop was searched, and though it smelled of sawdust and varnish, nothing there connected to Abby's disappearance. Still, the late-night trips didn't sit right with anyone. Why had Paul been awake, working, on the very night his daughter vanished? Over the next week, as the search dragged on with no results, the focus shifted inward. Detectives noticed that Linda's statements kept changing in small but telling ways. First, she said the front door was open when she woke up. Then she said it was merely unlocked. She couldn't remember whether she'd heard the wind outside or just imagined it. Grief can distort memory, they told themselves, but inconsistency can also mean guilt. The sheriff's office asked both parents to take polygraphs. Paul passed the control questions but stumbled on the key one. Do you know what happened to your daughter that night? His physiological readings spiked, but the examiner marked the results as inconclusive. Linda's test was similar, no deception detected, but no clarity either. The tests didn't clear them. They didn't condemn them. They simply left the case trapped in limbo. Meanwhile, the town kept talking. People whispered about the family's arguments, about how Paul was known to lose his temper after a few drinks. They whispered about Linda's brother, Rick Dalton, a man no one had seen in days. Rick was a drifter of sorts, living between construction jobs and bars across the state line. He'd done time years earlier for assault and theft, and though he'd been around the Henson property in the past, Paul never liked him there. The rumor was that Rick and Paul had nearly come to blows the last time he visited. Then, on the 7th day of the search, a hunter came forward. He said that in the early hours of the morning, Abby vanished around 2 a.m. He'd been out in the woods behind the ridge near the Henson property checking his traps. He'd seen headlights through the trees, a blue pickup truck idling near the creek, engine running but lights dimmed. When he'd tried to get closer, the truck turned and drove off fast toward the back road leading out of town. The detail was specific enough to catch the detective's attention because, according to multiple residents, Rick Dalton drove a blue pickup. A bolo went out, but by then, Rick was already gone. Detectives dug into his record, a handful of arrests, bar fights, petty theft. He'd done short stints in jail. Nothing major, but the timeline matched too neatly. He'd left Maple Creek 2 days after Abby disappeared, supposedly to take a job near Chattanooga, but no employer ever confirmed that. His last known contact had been a phone call to his sister, Linda, the day after Abby went missing. What they talked about no one knew. When questioned, Linda said it was a short call, just family checking in. Investigators didn't believe her. Forensic teams returned to the Henson property. They searched the barn, the shed, and the surrounding woods again. Dogs picked up faint traces of human scent near the edge of the property but lost it by the creek bed. It led nowhere, another cruel dead end. By now, the weight of the investigation was destroying what little remained of the Henson family. Paul stopped going to work. He spent hours sitting on the porch, staring into the distance, chain smoking through the nights. Linda buried herself in church. Every morning she placed Abby's photo on the front pew, lighting a candle beneath it. She prayed loudly, publicly, the way desperate people do when silence feels unbearable. Caleb, the teenage son, retreated completely. His friends said he'd stopped showing up to school. When questioned again, he refused to speak at all. Not to police, not to his parents, not even to the family pastor. One neighbor recalled seeing him standing by the tree line one night, staring toward the barn, motionless for nearly half an hour before walking away. The detectives could feel the case slipping. Without evidence, without witnesses, it was all smoke. But something about the family's dynamic, their coldness, their distance kept the investigation from closing. They weren't grieving together. They were grieving apart. Each seemed to be hiding something, even if only from themselves. By late July, search teams had turned up nothing. No body, no weapon, no sign of struggle. The sheriff gave a final press statement saying the investigation was ongoing, but privately he told his deputies there was nowhere left to look. Then came the first anonymous tip. Someone called from a payphone at a gas station 20 miles away, saying they'd seen a blue pickup parked near an abandoned farmhouse outside town 3 nights after the disappearance. When deputies followed up, they found tire impressions and cigarette butts, but no truck. It was another thread that frayed as soon as they pulled it. Still, behind closed doors, detectives began to circle Rick Dalton's name in red ink. They knew he'd been close to the family, sometimes too close. They knew he'd been around the property before Abby vanished, and they knew that whatever he'd discussed with Linda that morning had left her shaken. But with no physical evidence and no sign of Abby, all they had were whispers. As the months turned into years, Maple Creek tried to return to normal. The school added a small memorial garden for Abby. The church kept her photo in the foyer. But the Henson family never recovered. Paul and Linda barely spoke. Caleb eventually left town, enlisting in the army at 18. People said it was his way of disappearing too. And though no one would admit it out loud, there was a feeling in Maple Creek that the truth wasn't somewhere out there, it was buried within the Hensons themselves. Every person in that family carried a silence that didn't feel like grief anymore. It felt like fear. Years later, when investigators revisited the file, they'd notice one thing that stood out. Rick Dalton's name had been underlined 3 times, and beside it, in faded ink, someone had written just 2 words, "Find him." But by then, Rick was already long gone, and the truth, whatever it was, had gone with him. Time has a way of burying things: evidence, memories, even guilt. By the winter of 1996, 6 months after Abby Henson vanished, Maple Creek had started trying to move on. The posters faded, the flyers were taken down from telephone poles, and the woods behind the farmhouse grew thick again with summer weeds. The search had ended long ago, though no one said it out loud. What lingered instead was a strange kind of silence that settled over the town, heavy and uneasy, the kind that people only broke in whispers. For investigators, the case had turned cold faster than anyone wanted to admit. Leads that once felt urgent were now faint echoes. The sheriff's office had done everything they could: dozens of interviews, hundreds of man-hours, countless dead ends. But as the weeks turned to months, even the detectives began to drift to other assignments. Files went into boxes, evidence into drawers. Abby's name, once the headline on every local paper, became another unsolved case number in the archives. Inside the Henson family, the silence became unbearable. Linda stopped attending church. She told neighbors she couldn't stand the looks, the pity, the suspicion. Paul lost his job at the sawmill after too many missed shifts and too many mornings spent drinking instead of working. He was seen less and less after that, sometimes sitting on the porch long after midnight, staring toward the woods where the search dogs had once barked and dug at the earth. And their son, Caleb, left as soon as he could. The Army took him in 1997, and by the time he shipped out, he'd stopped answering letters from home altogether. By the early 2000s, the farmhouse had been sold back to the bank. The grass grew waist-high, the porch boards rotted, and the curtains yellowed in the windows. Locals avoided driving past it at night. The new sheriff, a man named Gary Miles, inherited the cold case in 2004. He'd been a young deputy when Abby vanished, one of the men who'd searched the creek bed. He'd never forgotten the look on Linda's face that morning, the quiet panic that didn't seem like shock but something else, something practiced. When he reopened the file nearly a decade later, what he found inside was worse than he expected. Evidence logs missing signatures, interviews that had never been conducted, and one small bag of Ziploc filled with soil collected near the barn behind the Henson property. The tag was dated the 25th of June, 1995, 2 days after the disappearance. There was no lab report attached, no record of it ever being tested. Just a note in fading ink: possible disturbance near southwest corner. Sheriff Miles sent it off to the state crime lab, hoping for a miracle. The results came back weeks later. No clear biological material, no DNA profile, just trace elements of organic decay, too degraded to be identified. It was inconclusive, but it raised questions. Why had it never been tested before? And who had marked the sample in the first place? Miles tried tracking down the original investigators, but most had retired or moved on. When he contacted Linda, now living 2 counties away, she refused to meet. She said she'd put that life behind her, that reopening old wounds would do more harm than good. Her tone was calm, almost rehearsed. When he reached out to Paul, he was told the man rarely left his house and drank himself to sleep most nights. The only person who would speak openly was a neighbor, an elderly man named Don Brooks, who told the sheriff something he'd never reported before. He said that about a week after Abby disappeared, he'd seen Paul burning something behind the barn late at night, not trash, but something heavy wrapped in cloth. When Don asked about it the next morning, Paul said he'd been getting rid of old tools. Don hadn't thought much of it at the time, but in 2004 his memory sounded different. The sheriff logged the statement but couldn't prove a thing. The barn had been torn down years earlier. The ashes long gone. He went back through the file again, searching for anything that could bridge the gap between rumor and fact. There was one name that kept resurfacing: Rick Dalton, the missing uncle. Despite years passing, no one had ever located him. No record of arrests, no new address, not even a traffic ticket. It was as though he'd vanished just as completely as Abby. In the years that followed, the case faded again. Every so often, a new detective would review it, hoping fresh eyes might catch something others missed. But the file never gave up its secrets. The photos, the empty bedroom, the damp stuffed rabbit, the unmarked dirt behind the barn became the only pieces left of a story no one could finish. Then, in 2010, everything changed. That summer, a group of urban explorers from Knoxville posted a set of photographs online. They'd found the old Henson farmhouse, abandoned and half-collapsed, while exploring forgotten rural properties. The photos showed the interior rooms filled with debris, wallpaper peeling, light filtering through broken windows. But one image in particular caught the public's attention. It was of a child's drawing, scrawled directly on a bedroom wall in faded crayon. 3 stick figures, one small, between 2 taller ones. Above them were words written in a child's uneven handwriting: me, mommy, and uncle. If that kind of discovery chills you, the idea of finding what's been hidden for decades, then you'll want to see another case that still keeps locals awake at night. It's about a mother and her infant who vanished during a blizzard, and what was discovered inside a remote cabin 20 years later shocked even veteran detectives. The link to that story is waiting in the description, and if you think you're ready, watch it after this one. Within days, the image spread across social media. True crime forums lit up with theories. Some said it was just a coincidence, graffiti left by trespassers. Others were convinced it was Abby's hand, her last message to the world before she vanished. Detectives couldn't confirm when it had been drawn, but one fact was impossible to ignore. The drawing had been made on the wall of Abby's old room. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation reopened the case again, this time with digital forensics and public attention on their side. They returned to the property, searching the structure and the land beneath it with ground-penetrating radar. But nothing new surfaced, no remains, no artifacts. The only thing they found was the echo of old mistakes. Reporters tried contacting the Henson family for comment. Linda declined all interviews, stating through an attorney that she had nothing more to say. Paul was found living alone in a one-room trailer on the outskirts of Johnson County, his health failing. When a journalist asked if he believed the truth would ever come out, he said quietly, "The truth's been sitting out there for years. No one wants to touch it." It was the kind of statement that stuck in people's minds. Investigators tried again to reach Caleb, now a veteran stationed in North Carolina. He refused to participate, claiming he'd done his time with that family. To the public, their silence became its own answer, a family retreating from the world rather than facing what was left of it. By that point, the house had become a symbol, a ghost of its former life. Teenagers dared each other to visit it. Paranormal groups filmed shaky videos in its halls. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust through a broken window, became part of the town's folklore. But to the detectives still working the case, it wasn't ghosts they were looking for. It was accountability. For Sheriff Miles, the hardest part was knowing how close they might have come if the evidence hadn't been overlooked. That small bag of soil, the one left untested for nearly a decade, he couldn't stop thinking about it. What if that was the spot? What if the answer had been buried right there, waiting for someone to care enough to look? By the end of 2010, the farmhouse was demolished by order of the county for safety reasons. The land was left empty, a patch of weeds and foundation stones. But for the people who remembered the case, it never really went away. It was a scar on the town's conscience, the missing child, the secrets no one wanted to face, and a family whose silence had become louder than any confession. And even as the years went on, one question lingered. If Abby's story ended somewhere on that property, why did it feel like the people who loved her most were still trying to hide it? By 2019, Abby Henson's disappearance had become more myth than memory in Maple Creek. To most, it was a sad story passed down through generations, a warning parents told their kids at dusk about locking doors and staying close to home. But for investigators inside Tennessee's Cold Case Task Force, it wasn't folklore. It was unfinished business. A young detective named Aaron Colton had just joined the task force that year. Fresh out of the forensics division, she was assigned to review dormant child abduction files. Abby's stood out immediately, not because of what was in it, but because of what wasn't. A 6-year-old vanishes from her bed. No forced entry, no witness, no recovery. Decades of silence. And then one detail buried halfway down the evidence log. A soil sample collected near the barn, untested for nearly 24 years. Colton contacted the state crime lab in Nashville and had the sample expedited for modern DNA analysis. Technology had come a long way since 1995. Where early testing could only identify broad genetic markers, new methods could detect even trace cellular material, skin cells, hair fragments, organic decay invisible to the eye. Weeks passed before the call came in. The results showed partial human DNA degraded but readable, and it wasn't Abby's. It belonged to her mother, Linda Henson. At first, that didn't raise alarms. Contamination was always possible, especially in old evidence. But Colton noticed something else. The sample was taken from soil below the barn floor, several feet deep, where no one should have been walking. That small inconsistency reignited the case. The task force began reconstructing the Henson family timeline, every statement, every inconsistency, every unanswered question, from 1995. They learned Linda had moved out of Maple Creek less than a year after the disappearance, selling the property without ever returning. Paul, the father, had died in 2016 from cirrhosis of the liver. Caleb, the son, had been discharged from the Army and was living in Virginia. None of them had ever given a formal follow-up statement after the year 2000. Detectives requested permission from the current landowner to access the old Henson property, now a decaying structure half swallowed by weeds and kudzu. The farmhouse was little more than a skeleton roof caved in, windows shattered, the air heavy with mold and rot. But beneath the decay, the layout was still recognizable. The bedrooms, the kitchen, the cellar door near the kitchen's back wall. Colton and her team started there. The cellar had been sealed decades earlier, likely for safety. They pried open the warped door and descended into a damp, low-ceilinged room that smelled of earth and rust. The ground was uneven, the walls lined with crumbling stone. One of the crime scene technicians noticed something strange about the far wall, the mortar around. One section was newer, smoother, and didn't match the rest. When they tapped it, it sounded hollow. They documented everything before carefully removing the paneling. Behind it was a small, hand-built structure. Wooden planks, sealing what appeared to be a narrow doorway. It was no more than 3 feet tall, barely large enough for a child to crawl through. The door itself had been nailed shut and painted the same color as the wall, a deliberate effort to hide it. When they pried it open, the smell hit first stale, heavy air that hadn't moved in decades. Inside was a shallow underground space, roughly 6 by 6 feet, the walls made of packed dirt reinforced with timber. It looked like an old storm pit, likely used long before the Hensons owned the house. But what lay inside stopped everyone cold. On the dirt floor were remnants of fabric decomposed but still identifiable as a small blanket. Nearby, a cracked piece of ceramic shaped like a rabbit's ear, the glaze chipped away with time, and beneath the layer of soil, bone fragments, small, fragile, unmistakably human. The room fell silent except for the sound of cameras clicking and gloves brushing against the earth. Colton stood frozen, staring at the remnants of what had once been a child's world. Her comfort, her safety, her final resting place, buried beneath the home she vanished from. The forensics team spent 2 days excavating the pit. Every inch of soil was sifted and catalogued. They found additional fragments of bone, a few strands of light brown hair, and a corroded button believed to be from a child's pajama top. The remains were sent to the medical examiner's office in Knoxville for DNA comparison. The wait lasted 3 weeks, but no one in the task force doubted what they'd find. When the results came in, the confirmation was devastating. The remains matched the DNA profile of Abigail Henson. After 24 years, She had finally been found not miles away in some hidden field, not taken by a stranger, but buried beneath her own home. For the investigators, it was both relief and horror. Relief that they had finally brought an end to the question of where Abby had gone. Horror at what the evidence implied that someone in the Henson family had known all along. The discovery reopened every old wound in Maple Creek. News crews returned, parking along the same road where search teams had once stood in 1995. The farmhouse was taped off again, the ground crawling with forensic specialists. The new sheriff held a press conference confirming that human remains had been found and that foul play was suspected. He refused to elaborate, but behind closed doors, the task force already knew what the next step would be. The DNA found in the soil wasn't just a fluke. It placed Linda Henson in direct contact with the burial site, and given the location of the false wall, carefully constructed, intentionally sealed, this wasn't an accident. It was concealment. Investigators traced Linda to a small home outside Murfreesboro. She was 70 now, frail, living alone. When they arrived to notify her of the discovery, she reacted with almost unsettling composure. She didn't cry. She didn't ask where they'd found Abby or how they were certain. She simply sat down, hands folded, and said, "You found her then." That phrase lingered with the detectives. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't disbelief. It was something closer to resignation, as if she'd been waiting for this moment for decades. The team didn't arrest her immediately. They needed corroboration, something to prove she hadn't just known about the burial, but participated in it. They began piecing together her relationship with her brother, Rick Dalton, the man who disappeared shortly after Abby's death. Records showed that Dalton had died in 2007 a traffic collision in Georgia. His body had been cremated, leaving no chance for DNA comparison. But his name appeared in one final place in Linda's financial records. A single bank transfer in the summer of 1995, just days after Abby vanished, for the exact amount that matched the sale of one of Paul's tools. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it painted a clear picture. The family had been covering something up since the night Abby disappeared. When the excavation concluded, investigators unearthed one final piece, a metal hinge and nail set, identical to the type used in Paul Henson's workshop. It was the same hardware used to build the false wall. That night, when the evidence was logged and the farmhouse cleared for the last time, Detective Colton stayed behind for a few minutes alone. The cellar was dark, silent except for the creak of old beams. The air was still thick with the smell of damp soil. On the floor, faint impressions remained where the blanket and toy had rested. It was impossible not to imagine it a child's final moments, spent in a space that was never meant to exist, sealed away beneath her own family's house. The next morning, a forensic report labeled the site "Domestic Concealment of Homicide." The words were clinical, detached, but everyone who had stepped into that cellar felt the same sickening truth. Abby hadn't been stolen by a stranger. She'd been hidden, protected perhaps, in the twisted logic of someone's guilt by the very people who were supposed to keep her safe. The discovery changed everything. The mystery that had haunted Maple Creek for 2 decades was no longer about what happened to Abby. It was about why. The discovery beneath the farmhouse sent shockwaves through Tennessee law enforcement. For 24 years, the name Abby Henson had symbolized an unanswered question, a mystery that had hardened into legend. But now, with her remains found sealed beneath her own home, detectives weren't just chasing truth anymore. They were confronting a lie that had lived comfortably inside a family for nearly a quarter of a century. Detective Aaron Colton spent weeks reconstructing what had really happened in that house. Every scrap of evidence was re-examined, every forgotten lead reopened. The team tracked down old neighbors, the few still alive who remembered the night Abby vanished. Among them was a retired teacher named Martha Dean, who lived across the dirt road from the Hensons in 1995. Her statement would change everything. She recalled waking up around midnight the night Abby went missing. At first, she thought she heard thunder, but when she listened closer, it wasn't thunder at all, it was shouting. Muffled voices, male and female, carried faintly through the still summer air. She couldn't make out words, but she remembered one distinct sound that kept her awake long after. A child's brief, startled cry that was suddenly cut off. That detail, buried in an old, unlogged interview, matched what detectives already suspected, that whatever happened to Abby didn't come from outside that home. It came from within it. Through financial records and statements, investigators pieced together the truth about Rick Dalton, Linda's brother, Abby's uncle. In 1995, he had been on the run after a robbery in Knoxville. There had been an active warrant for his arrest. According to police reports from that era, he had nowhere to go, and his last known contact had been his sister. When detectives compared timelines, it was clear that Rick had been hiding out at the Henson property for at least 3 weeks before Abby vanished. At first, Linda denied it. She insisted she hadn't seen her brother in years. But as investigators confronted her with new evidence, his fingerprints found on a glass bottle from the barn, a handwriting match on a scrap of paper, recovered from the property, her composure began to fracture. During a recorded interview, when confronted with the DNA results and the soil analysis connecting her to the burial site, Linda finally broke. She sat in silence for nearly a minute, then whispered, "I didn't know what else to do." Her confession came out in fragments, halting and tearless, more exhausted than emotional. Rick had come to her desperate and filthy, saying the police were after him for something that got out of hand. Paul hadn't known he was there. Linda had been sneaking him food, cash, and clothes, keeping him hidden in the barn loft behind the hay bales. She claimed she thought it would be temporary, a few nights until he could get himself straightened out. But on the night of June 23rd, something went wrong. Rick came into the house looking for food, and Abby woke up. According to Linda, she found him standing in her daughter's bedroom, whispering frantically for the child to go back to sleep. When Linda walked in, Abby was crying, frightened by the stranger in her room. Linda said she panicked. She grabbed Rick's arm, shouting at him to get out before Paul heard. In the struggle, Rick tried to quiet Abby, covering her mouth for only a few seconds that ended everything. When it became clear what had happened, Linda described freezing completely. Rick kept saying it was an accident, that no one would believe them if they called the police. He convinced her that if Paul found out, it would destroy the family, that it would ruin her, ruin him, ruin everyone. And somewhere in the chaos of guilt and fear, Linda made a decision she would never undo. Together, they carried Abby's body down to the cellar. Rick found the old storm pit and said it would just be temporary. Linda claimed she believed him, that he promised they'd find another way to explain it in the morning. But morning came, and she didn't speak. The next night, Rick sealed the pit, covering it with wood and dirt. Linda said she couldn't bring herself to stop him. She remembered the sound of the hammer striking the nails, echoing faintly through the floorboards while Paul slept upstairs. When investigators asked her why she hadn't gone to the police afterward, she said something that chilled everyone in the room. "Because he was still my brother." The days that followed the disappearance played out exactly as history remembered. Linda told Paul she couldn't find Abby. They called the sheriff. They watched the search teams comb the woods. But beneath the layers of shock and grief, she already knew the truth. Linda said Paul found out days later. She didn't tell him outright, he noticed. He noticed her avoiding the cellar, her shaking hands, the missing blanket from Abby's bed. When he finally confronted her, she broke down. She told him everything. Paul's reaction, according to Linda, wasn't rage. It was disbelief, and then silence. He sat at the table for hours that night without speaking. The next morning, he burned his work clothes in the barrel behind the barn, the same fire neighbors later described seeing. From that moment forward, they both lived as ghosts inside that house, bound by a secret they could never unmake. When asked what happened to Rick after that night, Linda said he left town within days. He promised he'd fix things once he got clear of the law. She claimed she never saw him again. The confession shocked everyone who heard it, not because of what she said, but because of how ordinary her words sounded. There was no dramatization, no defense, no sense of redemption. Just a quiet, worn-out voice recounting the single moment her life had split in two. The investigators left that interview deeply shaken. Many of them had worked homicide cases for years, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't evil in the cinematic sense. It was human, raw, desperate, and tragically believable. A mother trying to protect what little she thought she had left. even as it meant burying her own child to do it. The district attorney's office reviewed the case for charges. Given the decades that had passed, the condition of evidence, and Linda's age and health, prosecution became uncertain. What they did have was enough to confirm the truth and finally, to close the case file marked Abigail Henson. Detective Colton later said the hardest part wasn't hearing Linda's confession. It was realizing that everyone who'd lived in that house had known, in their own way, what was under it. The brother who fled. The father who drank himself into silence. The son who enlisted and never came home again. For 24 years they'd each carried their share of the lie. As for Linda, she remained in custody for several days, then was released pending further review. Reporters waited, outside her small home for a comment. She never gave one. Neighbors said she stopped answering the phone and rarely left the house. When asked by detectives if she believed Abby forgave her, Linda said quietly, "I hope she doesn't." It was the final sentence entered into the file before it was sealed. The story of Abby Henson didn't end with a suspect in handcuffs or a courtroom trial. It ended the way it began, in silence. The kind that lingers after the truth finally surfaces, when everyone realizes it was there all along, waiting to be spoken. And yet, even with answers, one question remains. Was it love that drove a mother to hide her child's death, or fear of losing everything else? When the truth about Abby Henson's death finally came to light, Maple Creek felt like a town waking from a 24-year nightmare. It was no longer just a mystery to be solved, it was an old wound reopened in front of everyone who had once searched for her. The fields where volunteers had walked shoulder to shoulder were long overgrown, but the memories of that summer had never really gone away. Now, they had a face to put to the silence and, painfully, it was one they had known all along. In late 2019, Linda Henson was arrested on charges of obstruction, concealment of a death, and aiding an offender. The news traveled fast, spreading across the same radio frequencies that once broadcast Abby's missing child alert. The image that appeared on every local station showed her being escorted from her small home in Murfreesboro. Frail, gray-haired, eyes downcast, wrists bound in handcuffs. For some, it felt like justice. For others, it felt hollow, because by then, most people in town had come to realize that what happened inside that farmhouse wasn't a story about evil. It was a story about fear and how it had quietly destroyed an entire family. Rick Dalton's name reappeared too. Even though he had been dead for over a decade, a warrant was formally issued posthumously. It was procedural, mostly symbolic, a final act of acknowledgement that he had played a role in Abby's death and its cover-up. But his absence only deepened the sense of injustice. There would be no confrontation, no trial testimony, no reckoning between siblings, just silence, the same kind that had surrounded the case from the very beginning. Paul Henson didn't live to see his wife's arrest. He died that spring, found slumped in his armchair with a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. Among his few personal belongings was a folded piece of notebook paper. It was short, written in shaky handwriting. "We thought we were protecting her. We were only burying her twice." When detectives found it, they didn't quite know what to make of it, a confession, an apology, or something in between. But to those who had worked the case from the start, it captured what the entire investigation had revealed, that the people who claimed to love Abby most had also been the ones who erased her. Linda's legal proceedings moved slowly. She was deemed mentally unfit for a traditional trial due to her age and declining health. Instead, she entered a plea agreement, acknowledging her role in concealing her daughter's death. The judge's words were brief: time served, house arrest, mandatory counseling. For many watching, it felt like an incomplete ending, but in another sense, there was nothing left to punish. The person who committed those acts in 1995 wasn't the frail woman standing before the court. She was a ghost of herself, trapped in the same memory she'd helped create. Outside the courthouse, cameras caught a glimpse of Linda as she was led to the waiting car. For a split second, she looked up toward the crowd, not defiantly, but with something closer to exhaustion. Among the onlookers were two former detectives who had worked the original search. They had spent years haunted by the mistakes of the investigation, the missed interviews, the untested evidence, the assumption that monsters always came from the outside. Watching her that day, both men said later, they didn't feel anger. They felt something closer to pity. The farmhouse itself didn't survive much longer. After the discovery of Abby's remains, the county condemned the property. It sat fenced off for months, the structure sagging and silent, until a demolition crew arrived in the fall of 2020. As the excavator tore through what was left of the living room walls, reporters stood nearby, recording the collapse of a house that had hidden a secret for almost a generation. Beneath the debris, the cellar still existed, the false wall already dismantled by investigators. That space, once sealed and forgotten, was filled with concrete and earth. It was as if the town wanted to make sure it could never hold another secret again. In its place, a small memorial garden was built. Volunteers, some of whom had been children themselves during the 1995 search, planted wildflowers, a stone bench, and a plaque etched with 6 simple words. In memory of Abigail Henson, 1989 to 1995. Finally, home. The dedication ceremony was quiet, attended by fewer than 30 people. Among them were former Sheriff Gary Miles and Detective Aaron Colton, the two who had reopened the case years apart, but had both refused to let it die. They spoke little that day. Both admitted later that standing there felt strange, like being in the presence of peace that hadn't been earned. The garden was beautiful, but beneath it lay the dirt where everything had gone wrong. Miles said he found himself glancing toward the nearby trees, remembering the search dogs barking, the floodlights cutting through darkness, and the hope they had all clung to back then, the hope that maybe Abby had been taken, maybe she was out there somewhere waiting to be found. Now they knew she had never left. In the years that followed, the Henson case became a cornerstone in cold case seminars across Tennessee. It was studied not for the brutality of the crime, there was none, but for the psychology behind it. It became a cautionary tale about the quiet kinds of damage that occur when people choose denial over truth. The slides shown to new investigators weren't of the crime scene or the evidence. They were of the house itself, before demolition, a faded, ordinary home, its walls cracked but standing, its secrets just beneath the floor. The lesson, as one instructor put it, was simple. Sometimes the greatest danger to a child isn't found in strangers, but in the fear that lives inside their own home. Linda Henson died in 2022, alone in a nursing facility outside Nashville. Her obituary didn't mention Abby, but the staff later said she often spoke to an imaginary child in her final months, asking her to come inside before it gets dark. It was the kind of detail that blurred the line between guilt and grief, between remembering and reliving. Today, Maple Creek looks different. The new families who moved in know the story only through whispers, or through the occasional true crime documentary that revisits the case. The memorial garden still stands on the outskirts of town, often overgrown by midsummer, its flowers wilted in the Tennessee heat. Every year, someone no one knows who leaves a small stuffed rabbit at the base of the plaque. Detective Colton, who has since retired, still visits occasionally. She said it's not the kind of case you can file away, even after closure, because this one wasn't about chasing a monster or exposing a killer. It was about the slow erosion of love, about the way silence can become its own crime. And as she once said in an interview years later, "We didn't find Abby in the woods or a river or miles away. We found her under the one place everyone swore she was safe. That's what haunts you. That's what keeps you awake." In the end, the story of Abby Henson became less about what happened on that June night, and more about everything that followed, the lies that were told to survive it, the shame that buried the truth, and the years it took for someone to dig it up again. For the people of Maple Creek, closure came quietly. There were no parades, no press conferences, no grand declarations of justice served. Just the knowledge that a little girl who vanished into the dark had finally been brought back into the light, and that sometimes the hardest truths to face are the ones that live closest to home.